Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Troy Schneider, president of GovExec 360, and it's my distinct pleasure to welcome you to today's webcast, Modernize with Confidence for a Flexible and Scalable Future in the Cloud. This webcast is brought to you by the Software Revolution, Inc. When IT technologies don't align with modern taxpayer needs and market demands, the need for flexibility and agility becomes paramount to the long-term success of an organization. Mix in the high costs of maintaining a legacy system and a skilled developer shortage for some software languages, and it's easy to see why some leaders feel severely limited in their ability to serve the public. To transform these systems, the Biden administration has made it clear that IT modernization is a key priority and has provided budgetary support through programs like the Technology Modernization Fund. Still, others struggle with where to even start. So how can leaders modernize decades-old mainframe applications with minimal disruption to mission-critical work? What key considerations must be made to leverage the power of modern platforms while keeping taxpayer dollars in mind? Thankfully, I have two experts here to help answer these questions today and to further explore the government's continued efforts to modernize legacy systems. We'll look at how this enables agencies to find new value in their data and deliver better citizen services. And most importantly, where to even begin the process. So I'd like to introduce our guests today. We have Doug Manning, who is the Operational Vice President for GovCIO, and Roger Knapp, the Executive Vice President of Engineering and Service Delivery for TSRI. Gentlemen, welcome. Thanks for being here. So gentlemen, I think this conversation really falls into two parts. First, we want to talk big picture, just about what advice you have for leaders who are working to modernize their mission critical work. Then we really want to dig into the specifics of this transformation effort at the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Really want to understand your work together and what our audience could maybe take away from this particular case study. So let's start with introductions. And Doug, can you just tell us a little bit about your work, what you do, and how you worked with Roger on this particular HUD project?
Sure. So like you said, Doug Manning, I'm Operational Vice President here at GovCIO. I was actually the initial solution architect for the project, long-term contract, long-term client of ours at Department of Housing and Urban Development. And one of their longest standing problems that they've had for years and years and years is a Unisys mainframe that ran several of their very critical mission, critical systems. And as you mentioned, the workforce is aging, availability resources, cost of the hardware platform and flexibility of the hardware platform. So we came to the customer along with Roger and TSRI. We did a prototype and they loved it. They didn't have any funding at the time, but we'll touch on that probably later, where TMF came along and actually gave them the capability to move forward with the project.
Great. And Roger, sort of same questions to you. Tell us a little bit about yourself and how you've approached this partnership.
Sure. So I've been working at TSRI for about 22 years, currently Executive Vice President for Engineering and Service Delivery, so overseeing the technical side of the company. And I started out as an aerospace flight controls engineer, so dealing with autonomous vehicles, flying vehicles, and then migrated over to TSRI to work developing autonomous software developers. So I worked as a transformation engineer for a lot of that time and still get into that kind of work even now on some of our projects. So it's very interesting work for me, and I enjoy doing it a lot. I did work with Doug on that original POC, and then a few years later, it came back to life and we got to plan out and execute this project. So it was a pretty interesting project, had some challenges, but ultimately it was very successful.
Great, great. Well, before we really talk about the project in detail, let's talk bigger picture for a minute. And Doug, if you could help set the stage, what is the value in modernizing legacy systems? I mean, we know that's a noble goal, but where do we see the greatest impact and the opportunity from these efforts?
Well, I think every situation is different, and I think you really have to, before you dive into the project, look at what do you want to get out of it and set your goals and be realistic with your goals. I think that's one of the keys to our success. We didn't we did a lot. We changed a lot. We did accomplish all of our goals, but we kept our goals manageable, and we didn't try to do too many things. And I think, from the very initial presentation to the government, our suggestion was, here are the goals. Let's stick with these goals, and then, get the results that we're hoping for. And, and as Roger said, I think we're very successful. And I think I've been serving that agency for close to 40 years, and I would challenge anybody to tell me a bigger, more significant single accomplishment than what was done with this project. So,
Roger, I'm interested in your take on the value proposition as well, but I'd also like you to speak to where the major challenges lie in this sort of effort. So maybe if you can talk about both of those aspects.
Okay, so we've done a lot of modernization projects, including the HUD modernization with Doug's team. And many of our clients have very essential business processes running on these legacy environments. And but they're facing obsolescence, perhaps increasingly lack of skilled labor force available to them. So they're looking about finding a way to retain their capability, but address the obsolescence and reduce their ongoing maintenance and operation costs. So that's a lot of the value we can provide. We will basically let them modernize their technology, but keep their business process essentially the same. And so in terms of what are the challenges, there are several challenges that come up in projects like these. The one that Doug alluded to is a big one, making sure that you actually come in with realistic goals. So sometimes when you start on one of these projects, there may be some folks on the customer side that want to perhaps couple a re-engineering of their processes at the same time as they're doing this modernization. That can add a lot of risk to the project, because you're changing the technology stack and the process at the same time. You don't necessarily end up with a functioning system in the end. We recommend going through a technology update, and then when you're in the target environment and you've got a solid baseline that's made it through validation, perhaps it's even into production, then you can look at doing your ongoing engineering and maintenance from that point.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And I just to add in, I think Roger hit it right. I think that's probably the single biggest failure that people have, is they try to do both at the same time. And oftentimes the people that are just not available to make that commitment to figure out what the business needs to do. What we were lucky enough to do, we could focus just on technology, and we didn't have to bother the stakeholders, and didn't have to schedule meetings and deal with all that. We could just focus on the technology. And I think Roger's right. That's probably the biggest failure point on projects that don't go forward.
And that sort of segues nicely into the question of what the leaders in an organization need to look for and sort of do preemptively to avoid these problems. You just touched on the scoping and not trying to do too much, but are there any other sort of initial considerations that you feel are just absolutely critical that people need to keep in mind as they embark?
So I can take a first cut at that,
Sure.
Doug, and then maybe you can weigh in. But there's a lot of upfront analysis and planning that you want to do so that you can identify what are going to be the challenges on the project, and then systematically work through those and have a plan. So what are those typically? A big one is all the interfaces that are on the edges of the system you're going to modernize. It can be a challenge just to identify what those are, but getting those identified is critical. Typically we do, we'll have a series of planning workshops with all the parties to try to surface all these interfaces. And so coming up with a plan for what you're going to do with the interfaces is important. Also, we like to have a look at the code or some portion of the code, if possible, during the planning phase, because then we can also evaluate what kind of language feature challenges we might have. TSRI has got the language features pretty well nailed, but we still run into some interesting, situation types in the code that that require new creative solutions. So trying to get all that figured out up front is important. And I'd say, one other aspect of that, we always call it the externals analysis, but there's typically quite a bit of some sort of a call reaching out of the system being modernized to, legacy system services or maybe another mainframe service. So that's another kind of interface that you have to plan for, but it's one that we can help identify just by doing a static analysis on the code. So, typically we'll get a snapshot of the code, we'll do our analysis, prepare some, preliminary transformations, and the output of that is one of the inputs to this planning process, along with all the SME expertise on, all the systems that surround it and the interfaces.
Great. And Doug, anything you'd add there?
Yeah, I think I totally agree with what Roger said. We very much enjoyed when they first took the scan of our code and came back and said, "This is some things we're finding," and we're saying, "No, we're sure that's not happening." And sure enough, he was right. But probably the other thing from our side is the systems that we typically support, and I think the systems that need this kind of attention are not necessarily static. There are business changes that are happening all the time, either regulations that are changing or legislation, and we can't afford to stop the trainings for a year or two while we modernize the code. So, in our case, we'll talk about it later and with the specific project, but I think we only had about a 30-day code freeze from the time that we went live, and that was critical with these systems not to have a code freeze.
Right, and that's enabled by us using an automated process. One of the key things that TSRI focuses on is actually updating our process so that the code that comes out is very, very close to what needs to go into integration, test, and production. And that way we can always, accept in a new baseline update at proper times during a project and keep it synchronized with what's in production and avoid a long code freeze.
And that systematic approach dovetailed very nicely with our automated testing and so forth. So we could give Roger's team the baseline, they run it through, give it back to us. We run all of our automated regression tests, and if need be, kick it back to him. And it was a very smooth process.
Great.
Right. That's another key enabler, is having an automated test capability, because with an automated code conversion, we can identify maybe improved ways to generate certain situations from a maintainability or performance standpoint, and regenerate the entire system. We can process a few million lines an hour, so we can basically refresh the entire system and deliver, on a daily basis if needed. And if you don't have an automated regression test capability, it makes that it sort of takes that option off the table somewhat, because you'll have to spend quite a bit more effort to verify the latest baseline that's been generated.
Those are, I think, all important points. I want to pivot to the cost considerations for a second. And Doug, we talked in the intro about the high costs that come with maintaining legacy systems, but developing new systems is not, it can come with a real price tag as well. And so help walk me through this. How does one begin to do the scoping of the pricing, and then we'll turn to where you go look for that funding.
Sure, and I think there's a lot of sources for the costs, and in the HUD example, we're going to continue to maintain the code going forward. It's not 100% modernized. It's we see it as a first step. We got rid of that mainframe. It's all in the cloud now. But the business is still going to change. It's still going to require the maintenance and so forth. But the ROI that HUD presented to GSA in the TMF process, they estimated $8 million a year in just platform savings by moving off of that. You think about that very highly proprietary platform, limiting hosting availability for that type of thing, limited DR capability for that type of thing. So, I don't know that the people cost will change significantly less with the modernized system, but certainly the platform, the software platform, hardware platform, the hosting options available to us certainly changed and are cheaper.
Sure. And so, yeah, I mean, I hear sort of thinking through the total cost of ownership being an important part of this and of any project. For this particular one, funding did come from the TMF. And do you have any advice for audience where the main hurdle is finding the right funding streams? Should the TMF be the first place they look, or are there other other funding models to consider first?
Well, again, I think every agency is different, and I wouldn't suggest I'm an expert on every agency, but I think the TMF did give, one of the problems that HUD always had was, just like every other agency, there's unfunded mandates, there's all types of things coming at us all the time to just keep the trains running, and to be able to make an investment in order to save long term was always the problem. There's, if we could just get it done instantaneously, we could save money and we wouldn't have a problem. But you have to make the investment in order to make the savings, or have the savings in the future. So I think, in HUD's case anyway, TMF gave them that boost to get things started in order to save money. Now, they also have to pay TMF back. That's part of the deal. But that was in their decision-making process.
Sure, but TMF was designed to help agencies get over that hump and to be able to get the funding up front for things that would pay dividends down the road. So for agencies that are looking for these sort of modernization efforts, can you talk a little bit about what it was like to work on a TMF-funded project, and what sort of preparation and justification was needed to get the sign-off for this?
Well, in our case, like I said, back in 2016, I did the proposal to the CTO at the time. Roger and his team helped us put together the prototype, and then it sat on the shelf for about 2 years until TMF came along, and they're saying, "Hey, we've got this proposal on the shelf." They took it off the shelf, they dusted it off, they put it in the TMF format, and we weren't part of that. That was a government to government process. But what we were told is having that prototype and the preparation went a long way to being one of the initial awardees of the TMF funding. We were one of the first 4 that were awarded. Now, as far as the project execution, there was quite a bit of oversight, project management help, if you will, from the board, and there were quarterly meetings. And again, we weren't part of that, but we certainly helped with the briefings and prepared our government counterparts to go up and brief the board and make sure everything was staying on track.
Sure. And Roger, anything you'd add there about just how the advanced preparation can help?
Certainly. So oftentimes in a project, when we're going through what I call the assessment phase, where we're trying to flesh out all the challenges that there are going to be on a project with interfaces and so forth that I pointed out earlier, one of the main strategies we may have, if there's a significant one, is to do a proof of concept, basically a smaller project. Try to pick some thread of activity that's meaningful, that you can do, but isn't going to result in a huge amount of code conversion and testing, just enough so that you can burn down the risk on these sort of challenges. And so that's when a POC is appropriate, and that's what was actually done in this case.
Mm-hmm. And Roger, if we can sort of stick with you for a moment, I know projects like this, one of the challenges that often arises is just getting the buy-in internally, even before one tackles the funding challenges. But just getting that support, the commitment that this is worth doing, and that they're willing to earmark time and resources going forward. How do you recommend approaching that, and what have you seen work well?
So, first of all, you do need to make sure that everybody understands that we're going to have some reasonable goals. There's no magic involved. And whenever somebody thinks there's magic involved, that always makes me nervous. I'm like, no, this is good old hard engineering work.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you all have been touching on this particular HUD project as we talked bigger picture, but I'd like to really drill in a little bit on this specific case study and your work together in modernizing and moving from the mainframe to the cloud. And so, Roger, as I understand it, there's only a handful of engineers who really know how it feels to lead a major government agency through an automated mainframe modernization of this scale. And you're one of them. So at a high level, what is the biggest impact that engineers in similar roles are able to have on a transformation of this kind?
So I'd say the biggest impact they can have is helping to point out where the challenges are going to be, and basically drawing on experience from past projects. Oftentimes we can help ferret out what those issues are, maybe more rapidly than other folks that haven't been through this process several times. We help a lot with providing advice on how best to solve certain problems, based upon how it's worked or not worked on previous projects. That can help with, the kinds of problems you find on interfaces. A lot of times you're working to identify, how can we avoid impacting the other systems around us? So what interfaces can change, what interfaces need to be held constant. Also, that same thinking can lead into your test strategy. Oftentimes we have a situation where we can identify interfaces that are being held constant. And if it's, some sort of a service type interface, maybe a request response type interface, you can actually just do a record playback type of testing where you'll instrument that interface on the legacy environment and use that to generate test cases for the target system, and that works very well. So basically, I'd say, how can an engineer most help a project is just basically coming with a good set of tools and some creative thinking about how to solve these kind of problems, and helping the team to sort of identify what the challenges are going to be up front.
Right. And this next question, I mean, we could probably fill up an entire webcast just with this, but, can you, at a relatively high level, can you walk me through what this project entailed and the specific goals? And in terms of what it entailed, I think maybe the point you just made of what sort of tools and creative thinking that you brought to the project, given the goals.
Sure. So what we wanted to do was break the dependency off on the Unisys mainframe and get into a modern language. One of the main dependencies from the Unisys mainframe was the dependency on its DMS 2200 hierarchical database. And we had already worked with another vendor who was an expert in building solutions for that, and proved it out on a large Air Force logistics project. So we were able to bring them in, and they were able to handle that. Another challenge with Unisys that is kind of unique is they have 36-bit words. You wouldn't necessarily think, okay, well, how is that going to impact things? But when you start trying to figure out how to model a data structure that needs to be laid out to the bit, it can become an interesting problem.
Interesting.
So there was various other interesting things along the way. Doug will laugh because I'm going to say the dynamic SQL. That was probably the most interesting thing from a transformation standpoint. This particular code base had been written with a combination of static SQL and dynamic SQL, and so just to meet the sort of security requirements on the modern side, you don't want to have any of that dynamic SQL around if possible. So we actually built an expression evaluator that simulated what the business process was doing at translate time. And then from that, we were able to extract out some SQL that we were able to parameterize and turn into static SQL. And so that was a pretty interesting aspect of the project, something that was totally new to us, that came with this project, but that's an example of, something that inevitably crops up on any project as a new challenge that you have to find a way through. It's part of what makes the job interesting.
Okay. And Doug, anything you'd add there again about the goals of the project or the kind of creative solution finding that was required for that?
Yeah, and I said it early on. I think the goals were one of the very important things. Our goals from high level goals were we had to shut down the Unisys mainframe. We had to do it in 2 years. We had to ensure that the system did everything it did before and nothing differently. We had to ensure that we kept all the trains running and met all the legislative changes and so forth. And then we had to have minimal impact from subject matter experts and stakeholders and so forth. So those were our goals. And, I think that's one of the reasons we chose to work with TSRI, and we like their approach and that the way they approached it as an engineering project. We looked at a lot of different solutions over the years of ways to do it and really liked the approach. And like I said, I think from our side, the automated testing was key. To make sure it was successful. So,
and ask this of both of you, like, why was this the right time to tackle this project? Was it because the funding became available? Was it because we'd really reached the end of the functional lifespan? Like, why now versus 2 years ago or 2 years hence?
From TSRI's standpoint, at one point we had not done Unisys mainframe migrations before. So from the standpoint of HUD, they were able to take advantage of the fact that we got a major, Air Force logistics system off of Unisys in prior years that gave us a lot of capability that we could build on top of that, really enabled us to support the HUD project.
Yeah, and I think from the HUD standpoint, we did have unfortunately, he left in the middle of the project or towards the beginning of the project, but we had somebody that really understood that this was a serious risk in the future to stay on this platform. The system had reached end of life. I think they were already paying extra to keep the system around and not buy a whole new mainframe. So in fact, that it was the second time that they reached the end of life, and the previous time they had no other plan and they just bought another one and kept spending money. So I think it all came together. Having that executive leadership was critical to at least shepherd the project through.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And Doug, I sort of asked you about like sort of the goals and the creative solutions, but for your team in particular, what were the biggest challenges or the stumpers that you ran into?
Oh, I don't know. That's a good question. These systems, Roger mentioned interfaces. One of the systems, the first one that we went live with, had 100 interfaces to other systems, internal to HUD, external to HUD, mainframe platforms, SQL Server platform, Sybase platform, Oracle platform, 2 different service buses. So, Roger was working on the core, the business, the COBOL conversion. We were dealing with, all the wrappers, all the touch points to all the other thing, and frankly, coordinating with all the different people as well, because in a lot of cases there are systems that may be maintained by other folks, and there may be systems that don't have support on them and so forth. So, there was a lot of coordination that had to happen. One of the decisions that we made, and again, it was key, I think, to our success, is we decided not to change the user interface. Okay, so by not changing the user interface, and then we changed the back end, the database, and basically everything except the user interface, it was very conducive to regression testing. So, and we didn't have a training component to worry about either. So when we went live, no one knew that there was a change.
Interesting. And and how did you decide when it was ready to go live? Was it was there a kind of predetermined testing threshold that that you had to hit, or was it more learning as you go? Talk just a little bit about that criteria and what the testing process looked like.
Well, we tested, as I said, we tested all along, and it was constant testing. And so, it was, we kind of talked internally as we got closer and closer and closer, that there were probably quite a few people in the building that didn't think this was going to happen. We were very confident. We planned the go live or the cutover for a 3-day weekend, 4th of July weekend. So we have the maximum amount of time for any kind of contingencies. The system went down on schedule, Friday evening, and we had that 3-day weekend to make sure everything went live, when the business came on Tuesday. Everything went so smoothly that the full conversion migration of 40 years worth of data was done in 12 hours. And we made the go live call Sunday morning and had a night 4th of July picnic. That I can't stress enough, the automated testing that dovetail right in with the engineering approach from the conversion, that we didn't have any surprises. So.
And Roger, sort of same question to you. There's the automated testing, there's the there's the expert assessments that come from those working on it. How did you approach measuring when this is ready to go live?
So we're basically checking ourselves as we go through our own processes, so that nothing's in a big leap. The way our conversion process works is we'll first be able to point out any problems with the baseline, any discrepancies, missing files and so forth, and we'll get a good baseline down. Then we run our transformation engine over the code. It will point out to us situations where it doesn't have proper handling for that kind of a situation, and we'll systematically work those off. We try to design the transformation process so that problems with the transformation will be surfaced as early as possible in the project. So resolving issues that are pointed out by the transformation engine is what comes next. Then we go through a process of getting the code to compile and further refining the code. We'll also typically do code quality scans, which will provide another feedback loop to the code conversion process, where we make adjustments to address findings from that. In this particular project, I think we used check style, and there was one other one, can't remember what it was, sorry Doug. But we also typically use Sonar Cube, which can find situations which deserve addressing. Some of our customers require security scans, so we'll go through those as well. And basically all of these are providing feedbacks to our conversion process, and we'll be updating the conversion process to address them. Mm-hmm. And then we get into actual functional testing with Doug's team. And what we'll see is maybe there's sort of a higher rate of issues cropping up early in the project as we work through integration issues and so forth. But eventually you'll get to a point where there's not very much activity coming in over the JIRA tickets. Mm-hmm. And that's when we start to realize, okay, this thing is starting to stabilize and mature, and we're comfortable with it going forward.
Excellent. Well, I have sort of a subjective question for you both. I mean, getting a project like this over the finish line is a substantial win in and of itself. But how do you measure the success of a project like this? What when were there other metrics of how well these goals have been achieved? Like what's your standard of success? And Roger, we'll start with you.
So of course, achieving functional equivalence, that's our number one objective. We also want to produce code that's as maintainable as possible. So we'll, adapt our process for the coding standards of our customers and so forth. And then really, the number one indicator is when they go live, we don't get calls in the middle of the night with a problem. So that's what I really look for.
Okay, and Doug, same question to you. What's your success criteria?
Much the same as Roger. In this case, I mentioned we went live on we had two different cutovers. The first one went live the Tuesday morning after 4th of July. 26,000 users, our typical user base. We didn't do any ramp up or any kind of parallel. We went live with all 26,000 users, and we had 2 trouble tickets in the first day. I actually called the project manager multiple times during the day and is anybody at HUD today? Have we heard anything? And I think we were getting similar calls from Roger saying, you guys doing okay over there? Because it was good. Now, similar with second go live with the CFO system. We paid out about $2 billion in the first 30 days and no problems whatsoever.
Good.
We're very happy.
Excellent. I'll note that this went live on my birthday, which is a great day for a launch. So we are just about at time, gentlemen, but I'd like to leave our audience with sort of a key takeaway from this conversation and your work together. And every modernization project is different, obviously, with different challenges, different mission objectives. But for those who are kind of just diving into their organization's transformation efforts, wonder if each of you have one piece of advice you'd leave them with, and Roger will give you the first start.
Okay, that's a big one. I don't know if it directly answers your question, but fostering a collaborative environment between your organization, you as the customer, and your partners that are working to modernize the system, I think is very important. To me, that's besides having properly scoped your goals, that's probably one of the biggest indicators of success, is if you have open channels of communication and people are free to surface issues as soon as possible and work together to resolve them. I'd say that's my biggest piece of additional advice.
Great. And Doug, we're going to let you have the last word on this topic.
I tell you, Roger, that's a hard act to follow. I agree with everything you said. And I'm just going to piggyback on something Roger said earlier. There's no silver bullet. There's no magic. It is hard work. It doesn't mean you can't have good techniques and good processes and so forth, but it is hard work. And if anybody comes to you with a solution that says, it's magic, we can solve all your problems, you might want to look elsewhere.
Great. Well, gentlemen, that does bring us to the end of our time, but I want to thank you both for sharing your time and expertise with us today.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Doug, for joining us as well.
Good to see you, Roger.
And those of you in the audience, I want to thank you as well for sharing your time with us. And if you missed any segment of today's presentation, be on the lookout for an email later this week for a link to the on-demand video. And I hope you will share these conversations with your colleagues to continue the dialogue around some of the government's most important and most complicated issues about modernizing government systems to better serve the citizen. So on behalf of GovExec, I'm Troy Schneider. Thank you for being with us and have a nice day.